I never thought I'd be making Minecraft videos again. It's been over a decade since I really sat down, hit record, and just talked to you guys. Back then, I was just a kid playing Minecraft, making videos for fun, not really thinking much beyond the game itself. But life has a way of pulling you in directions you'd never expect, and here I am, older, hopefully a little wiser, and with a hell of a lot more experience to talk about. It's funny, one of the things you do in Minecraft is build a house. You punch a tree, craft some planks, throw together a little shelter before night falls, but is it really a home? Or is it just a place to hide until the sun comes back up? I didn't think much about that when I was younger. Back then, a house was just a box to keep the zombies out, but now, all these years later, I find myself coming back to this game and I see it differently. I've moved across the country, lived in different states, spent years in the army. I got married, bought a house, and somewhere along the way, my idea of a home just completely changed. And I think that's something a lot of people can relate to. It's strange, isn't it? When you're young, home is this constant thing. You don't question it, it's just there. But when you grow up and suddenly it's not so simple. Maybe you move away, maybe your family moves on, maybe what used to be home doesn't feel like home anymore, and for a while you feel untethered, like you're just drifting. And I think that's something a lot of us struggle with. You graduate high school, maybe you go to college, maybe you start working, and suddenly you're not waking up in the same bed you've had since you were a kid. The people you grew up with will scatter. Your parents aren't making you dinner anymore. That house you always came back to, it might not even be yours to return to anymore. So what happens then? Where is home when home doesn't feel like home anymore? For most of my life, I've been living this question. I've been forced to redefine home over and over again. First, when I moved away from my dad as a kid, then when I moved in with him at 18, then when I joined the army and bounced between places I'd never been before, and at some point, home just stopped being about a place entirely. And that's kind of what I wanted to talk about today, because I know I'm not the only one who's felt this way. And if you're watching this, whether you're in high school, college, just starting out on your own, maybe even feeling lost, I just want you to know that you're not alone in this. Home is something we all try to hold on to, and sometimes it just slips away before we even realize it. But here's the thing. Home isn't just a place. It's not four walls and a roof. It's something deeper than that. And if you've ever felt like you don't have a home or like you don't belong anywhere, you're not broken. You're not alone, and maybe we can figure it out together. Because at the end of the day, home is something we build. Not just in Minecraft, but in life. Now, when you're a kid, home is easy. It's not something you question, it's just there. For me, home was my childhood house. The only town I really knew. My family, my siblings, my bed, my toys. It was where I lived when I wasn't in school, where I came back to every day. It was this constant, unshakable thing. And if you asked me then, I would have told you that home was that house, that neighborhood, those familiar streets. But even as a kid, I think part of me knew it was more than that. Because right off the bat, it just didn't seem that simple. My parents were divorced, and that complicated things. I spent my early years in the same state as both of them, seeing my dad every weekend, but home was still my mom's house, right? That's where I slept most nights, that's where my room was, where my other siblings are, where most of my life happened, but my dad's place, was that home too? It never really felt like it. I remember those weekends with my dad feeling like visits, like little breaks from reality. I'd pack a bag, stay a few nights, and then come back. It was great seeing him, of course, but something was off. Even though it had the makings of a home, a bed, a place for my stuff. It wasn't mine. And I think that's one of the first lessons I ever learned about what makes a place feel like home. It's not just about having four walls and a roof, it's about belonging. And then when I was 10, everything changed. We moved. And not just down the street, not just to a different part of town. We moved states away. Far away from my dad, far from everything I ever knew, and for the first time, I felt like I had lost my home. I remember that feeling so clearly, that moment of realizing my old home was gone. I wasn't going back. My school, my friends, the places I was used to, they were all in the rearview mirror, and suddenly I was in this new place, this unfamiliar house, this new town, and I had to start over. This was the first time in my life that I really started to understand that home isn't permanent. We like to think it is, that it's something solid and unchanging, but it's not. It can shift. It can be taken away, and sometimes you don't even get a say in it. But at 10 years old, you don't really think about it that deeply. You just adapt. You don't sit around philosophizing about what home means. You just try to make this new place feel as normal as possible. I made new friends, I got used to new surroundings, and eventually, that town, the one that I had never even heard of before, became home. Not because I chose it, but because it's where life put me. And looking back, that was probably the first big shift in my understanding of home. It's not always a choice, it's just where I ended up. And it's definitely weird how time does that to you. You know, I lived there from ages 10 to 18, so eventually it just became home. Not because I deeply connected with it, not because I couldn't imagine being anywhere else, just because that's what familiarity does. You wake up in the same bed enough times, and one day you just stop questioning it. And that's the thing, when you're a teenager, you don't really analyze home. You just exist in it. You go to school, hang out with friends, get through life. You don't stop to think about how fragile it is, how easily it can change, because up until that point, home has always just been something you just have. But then, it changed again. When I turned 18, my mom and the rest of my family moved to yet another state, and suddenly, the home I had grown used to, the town I'd spent nearly a decade in, wasn't mine anymore. I wasn't moving with them, and instead I moved in with my dad. And just like that, home shifted again. I was in a new place, a place that had never been home before, but suddenly, again, it had to be. There's this strange thing that happens when you move as an adult versus when you move as a kid. As a kid, you just accept it. You don't really have a choice, and you adapt fast. But when you're 18, it feels different. There's this weird sense of disconnection, like you're just a guest in your own life. Like home is supposed to be somewhere, but you're not sure where that is anymore. At first, living with my dad didn't feel like home. I had visited his house before, sure, but visiting and living somewhere are two very different things. It felt like I was borrowing a life that wasn't mine, stepping into a space that had never really belonged to me. But eventually, it became home. Why? Because it had to? And that's when I really started to understand something. Home is less about where you are and more about what you accept. Familiarity breeds comfort, and comfort over time just starts to feel like home. But just as I was settling into that idea, just as that place started to feel normal, it all changed again. Because just over a year later, I left. This time, I wasn't just moving to a different house or a different state, I was leaving everything behind. I joined the army, and for the first time in my life, I just had no home at all. Home just stopped existing. Before that, home had always been somewhere. It shifted, it changed, but it was always at least a place, a house, a town, a room that was mine. But the army stripped that away. For 4 years, I was everywhere and nowhere. South Carolina, California, Arizona, Louisiana. I was in these places, but they weren't mine. They weren't home. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't just adjusting to a new place. I was completely detached from the entire idea of home altogether. That's something people don't really talk about when they talk about the military. It's not just that you have to move around a lot, it's that you lose the concept of belonging anywhere. You don't have a place that feels like yours. Home just became something abstract. If I had to define it then, I'd say home was just wherever my stuff was. And yeah, that sounds kind of shallow, but when you don't have a real home, you cling to whatever you do have. And in the army, what I had was a small metal wall locker. You know, I always tell this story because it was the moment I realized how much my idea of home had really changed. In basic training, we weren't allowed to have anything that wasn't issued to us. No personal items, no reminders of the outside world. Everything we did have, our uniforms, our gear, our toiletries, was kept in our assigned wall lockers. That was it. That was ours, our tiny little scrap of personal space in a place that wasn't really ours at all. And of course, one night, the drill sergeants came in and wrecked it. Middle of the night. They burst in, they flipped beds, screamed at us, poured water on our heads as we did push-ups, and threw our stuff everywhere. Our carefully, meticulously organized lockers are one small claim to something completely destroyed. And I remember standing there, watching my things scattered across the floor and really actually feeling myself tear up. Not because of the yelling or the chaos, but because those were my things. This was my home in that moment, and they took it away. Now, I get it, it sounds ridiculous, right? Getting emotional over some folded clothes and a few hygiene products, but when you have nothing else, those little things matter. When your environment is completely out of your control, the few things you can control, your space, your belongings, become your anchor. And that's something I carried with me throughout my entire military career and even today. Home wasn't a place anymore, it was my duffel bag, my gear, the things I took with me, no matter where I went. When people go through major transitions like that, when they feel displaced or uprooted, they start attaching more meaning to objects. It's this sort of way of creating stability and instability. I knew a lot of soldiers that did it. People who moved around a lot do it. Even kids who experience a lot of change will cling to certain objects, stuffed animals, blankets, little things that give them a sense of continuity. You know, Nietzsche talked about something similar. He said that when life is chaotic, when the world around you feels indifferent and uncontrollable, you have to create your own meaning. And in the army, in those 4 years of constant motion, that's exactly what I did. I couldn't rely on places to give me a sense of home anymore, so I made it for myself in whatever small ways I could. A routine, a few personal items, a playlist of songs I listened to at the end of every day. That's what home became. And when I finally got out of the army, I thought things would go back to normal. I thought I'd find home again in a real place, a real city. But it wasn't that simple because after years of just not having a home, I wasn't sure what home even meant anymore. When I left the army, I thought home would just come back naturally, like I'd walk into the next chapter of my life and bam, I'd feel like I belonged again. But unfortunately, that's not how that works. After 4 years of bouncing between places that never felt like mine, I had no real attachment to anywhere. My childhood home was gone. My family had moved on to different cities. I didn't want to go back to where I'd lived before the army because it didn't feel like home anymore either, so I just did something unexpected. I moved to a town I'd never been to before. No history there, no childhood memories, no connection. Just a place that seemed interesting. I had a really good friend who lived there and another friend who though I didn't know it at the time, would eventually become my wife. So I figured, why not? Maybe home wasn't something you find, maybe it's something you have to build from scratch. Let me give it a shot. At first, it was weird. I had no roots there, no family ties. It wasn't like moving back somewhere familiar, it was like stepping into a blank slate. But my things came with me, and if the army had taught me anything, it was that my stuff was my home. I remember setting up my first apartment in this town, arranging my things, putting my books on the shelves, my decorations on the walls. It was small, kind of crappy, but it was mine, and that made all the difference. It wasn't about the town itself. I didn't have nostalgia for it. I didn't have history there, but I had my space. And for a while, that was enough. But something happened while I was there. You know, for the first time in a long time, I wasn't alone. I had friends, I had people I cared about, and over time, my attachment to this place wasn't just about my stuff anymore, it was about the connections I was making. And that's when I realized something big. Home was becoming more than just familiarity to me. It's not about where my stuff was, it was about who I was there with. I wasn't thinking about this in some big philosophical way at the time. I was just living my life, hanging out, working, meeting new people. And one of those people is now my wife. At first, she was just a friend, but as time went on, something changed, as they do, and eventually she became something more. I didn't know it then, but meeting her would change my entire definition of home. I'd spent so many years trying to define home through places and possessions. First it was my childhood town, then it was my things, then it was my routines in the army. But now it was shifting again. Because for the first time, home wasn't about just me. It was about us. I didn't wake up one day and suddenly feel like this town was my home. It wasn't a conscious decision. It just happened gradually, in small, quiet moments. Late night conversations, inside jokes, the way I started feeling more settled even though I was still technically in an unfamiliar place. Home isn't just where your bed is. It's not just where you store your stuff. It's where you start to invest yourself, where you put down your roots, even if they're small at first. It's where you want to stay. And for the first time in years, I actually wanted to stay. I wasn't just passing through anymore. I was building something. And when my wife and I bought our house, again, something changed. Up until that point, home had always been something temporary, something that could be packed up and moved. First, it was my childhood home, then it was my things, then it was wherever I happened to be stationed in the army. Even after the army, when I settled in that new town, I still carried this feeling that I could leave at any time, that home was something I held onto, never something I truly built. But buying a house, that was just different. For the first time, home wasn't just mine, it was ours. There's this weird shift when you've spent most of your life thinking about home as something individual, something you define for yourself. And for years, I thought, as long as I have my stuff, I'm good. I don't need a permanent place. I don't need to put down roots. And then suddenly I was signing papers for land, a building, a place I wasn't just occupying, but shaping, investing in, making better. Home wasn't just a space I existed in anymore. It was something I was actively building with another person. Before, home was about self-sufficiency. I could pick up and leave, and as long as I had my things, I was okay. But now, home was no longer just a survival mechanism. It wasn't where I just stored my belongings. Home was smelling my wife cook a grilled cheese in her panini maker. It was late nights watching Bob's Burgers on our hand-me-down couch. It was knowing that no matter what kind of day I had, I was coming back to this place, this person. Home is where you invest yourself. Home is where you put effort into something, where you create something lasting, where you're sharing that space with someone you love. It stops being just a place entirely. It becomes a relationship. And honestly, that was something I never truly understood until I had it. For most of human history, home wasn't about ownership or even stability in the way we think of it now. It was about community. It was about people. That's why even today, when we feel disconnected from home, it's rarely about the physical place. It's about feeling alone. It's about feeling like we don't have something to come back to or someone who knows us. I think that's why a lot of people, especially young men, struggle when they move out for the first time. You get your own place, your own apartment, and you expect it to feel like home, but it just doesn't. Not at first, because a home isn't just an empty room with four walls, it's something you have to build into. And that takes time. Home is where you choose to stay, where you put in effort, where you say, this is where I belong and I'm going to make it mine. Buying a house wasn't just about having a roof over our heads, it was about committing to something, about choosing to put our time and energy into a shared life. And again, that's the thing about home. It doesn't just exist, you have to make it. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't just existing in a home, I was building one. Here I am now, standing in front of this little house I built in Minecraft, and I can't help but think, it's kind of like real life, isn't it? Home isn't just where you start, it's where you build. It's what you make your own. It's not just four walls and a roof, it's not just a town you grew up in or a place where your things happen to be. It's not even always the people you started with. Home is what you choose to invest in. Home is where you feel safe. It's where you want to return to, and sometimes you don't even realize what home means until you've lost it, or until you've built something new. And that's the thing. You can always build it. If you're watching this and you feel like you don't have a home, if you feel alone, if you've moved around too much, if your childhood home doesn't feel like home anymore, if you feel disconnected, lost, just know that home isn't always a place. It's a feeling, a connection, a choice, and you can always find it because home isn't something you're given. It's something you make.